McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and I don't know if you ever heard of Eric Hoffer, and particularly the first book he wrote called The True Believer. So if you have, you'll really love this program. If you have not, you'll really love this program because you'll know who Eric Hoffer is. And Jim, why don't you start us by introducing our guest?
In 1983, President Reagan awarded Eric Hoffer the Presidential Medal of Freedom and called him an example of both the opportunity and the vitality of the American way of life. A self-educated drifter, a longshoreman along the docks in San Francisco, Hoffer and his writings have impacted our understanding of mass movements. He was one of the first to identify the core motivations of the people who joined them, and he's best known for his astounding work, The True Believer, describing mass movements and political fanaticism. He believed that people who were attracted to joining mass movements had several common traits, and his analysis remains pertinent to today's protests and movements. And we're so lucky to have with us Tom Shachtman. He's a historian, he's a social analyst, a film and documentary maker. In fact, in his bio, he states something that I think we all feel. I consider myself fortunate that I always wanted to write and have been able to do so since my undergraduate days. And indeed, he has been able to do that. In addition to working at the National Geographic Society and CBS News, Tom is the author of over 30 books, children's books, novels, poetries, histories, documentaries, including, of course, the subject of today's program, American Iconoclast, The Life and Times of Eric Hoffer. And after our viewers read that, they should also pick up a copy of The Memoir of a Minotaur. This is his most recent publication. Tom, great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
So obviously the first question has to be, who was Eric Hoffer?
Eric Hoffer was very big in the middle of the century, from 50s, 60s, early 70s. He was known as the longshoreman philosopher. He was a man who'd never been in school one day in his entire life, was the children of immigrant. He was a field worker in California, and then a dock worker, completely untutored in that sense. And he wrote a startling book called The True Believer that came out in 1951, right in the middle of the Cold War. And as it happened, a copy of that book found its way to General Eisenhower, who was knocked out about it. And later in life, in the 1960s, a copy of the book found its way to President Lyndon Johnson, who was knocked out about it. So you can imagine that these two very different men, very different political stripes and everything, were both knocked out by this single book. And you have to say, well, this was quite a phenomenon. And indeed it was. And he was a very, very unusual man for somebody who had written a book that had such intellectual power to it.
Yeah. And Tom, what for that viewer, what did he write about in The True Believer that was so important at that time? And what were the two major examples he used?
Well, what Hoffer's major insight was to take a look at mass movements in the person of the main person who believed in those mass movements, not the leaders. We understood about the leaders, about Adolf Hitler and Stalin, people like that, but what we really didn't understand was who the true believers were, the followers. And Hoffer's big insight was to look at this and said, the same sorts of people are those who became the most ardent Nazis and the most ardent communists. Now, this was quite astonishing in 1951 to think of people on the far right the Nazis, and on the far left, the communists, as basically being the same. But he also said that this is the same type of person who fueled mass movements throughout history, that religious zealots, that nationalists exhibited many of the same qualities of these very ardent followers. And it's the notion of the true believer that really caught people, because what it did was it synthesized something that they had felt but perhaps not said.
Yeah, I want to get back a little bit to his childhood and how he was blind for part of his life. And you said that he never had formal education. Tell us more about that.
When Hafer was about 5, he was living in the Bronx in New York with his mother and his father, both Alsatian immigrants. And his mother fell down the stairs with him in her arms, and she died. And he, very soon after that, went blind. He was 5 years old, never been to school. He came out of his blindness at around age 15. They had a sort of a nanny in the house who stayed there and who tutored him, shall we say, and became possibly even intimate with him. But his sight slowly came back. And the first book he read was Dostoevsky's The Idiot. And he said, why did he read that book? Well, his father had been calling him an idiot when he was blind, so he figured he might as well read this book. And he went on from there. And he read and he read and he read everything, but he'd sort of missed going to school. And then his father died when he was about 18. And that was the end of the family. The nanny had already gone back to Germany. And what happened was that the father was in the carpenters union. There was a small inheritance from the union, a stipend. And he said, well, I think I'd like it to take a trip to California because oranges grow on trees there. You know, you can live out of doors. There's just food for the taking and everything will be fine.
I can't let it go without talking about The Idiot, because some people have told me that that's a biography of me. And I have objected to that, by the way. But I've called a lot of people idiots, especially politicians. And that book by Dostoevsky was interesting, and how it impacted Hoffer was interesting. Now, I want you to go on and go forward to what he did in California, because as Jim mentioned with that question, what he wrote about is so much a part of who he was. So go ahead with his.
Yeah, he really believed in hard work and being a self-made man, didn't he?
Eric Hoffer believed that you should be able to go anywhere, land in a town where you've never been, find work, do it no matter how lowly it seemed, and get a roof over your head because you could pay for it, and take care of yourself. And that was his definition of what was important to do. He felt everybody should be working. He felt that people like Karl Marx really oughtn't to be writing about working men because they'd never been one. He went to California knowing nothing, having almost nothing. He read all these books that he brought with him. And then he had to sell them because he didn't have any money to live on. And then after he'd sold that and run out of that money, he had to do something. And he did the classic thing. He walked into a restaurant and said, can I wash dishes if you'll give me a meal? And he started from there. And then he was a Skid Row bum, not because he was an alcoholic, just because he wanted to read all the time, didn't want to do anything else. So he became out on the streets, and then he went out harvesting fruit and vegetables, a day laborer. And he did that for years and years and years. And
he really believed in a limited role of government, Dennis, which of course you will be very happy with. And yes, there's this quote, there's always a chance that he who sets himself up as his brother's keeper will end up being his jail keeper.
He loved to make these pithy kind of remarks, and he knew he was being over the top with them, but he figured that's the only way to get people to pay attention, to be a little extravagant in what you say and what you do. Just go on with the Hoffer story. He was a farm worker, a migrant farm worker, and he'd go into a town and he'd visit the whorehouse and then he'd visit the library. He had library cards in dozens of towns all up and down California. And he'd go in and he'd read and he'd start taking notes on the little 3x5 cards and 3x5 notebook. And I read those notebooks. They're at the Hoover Institution in his files. And that was the basis for my biography. And he'd just jot down things that occurred to him, or he'd take notes on things in library. And slowly during the 1930s and the early 1940s, he accumulated these together and finally came out with a book in 1951. Not a book that was composed in 1949. It was a book that was composed from the early 1930s through to 1951. And
was it hard for him to find a publisher?
Well, he had an agent who was a woman who was an editor at a magazine called Common Ground that he had tried to sell things to for years. And she took a liking to him. And eventually, I believe, they had an affair, but he was very much enthralled to what her editing could do for him. And in the last stages of the book, many other people sort of came on board, editors at the publishing house and other people to help shape this book, to say, well, maybe you were imprecise in what you said here. Can you say that again? Or what about this area that you haven't investigated? And he would come back, and he thrived under this this kind of a program. His tutor in all of it was Montaigne. One year, after the fruit was all picked, he decided he'd go up to a cabin in the woods and in the mountains, get himself snowed in. So he went and found the biggest, fattest book he could find. And it happened to be Montaigne's essays, which are 800 or 1,000 pages. And he found in Montaigne a real tutor, somebody who looked into himself in order to find out universals about the world, and who often wrote in aphoristic terms. So that's somewhat of where this came from.
Well, Tom, Tom, let me break in there for a second. You're exactly right about that, of course. And interestingly enough, and I don't think you know this, but many of our viewers do, we did a television program recently called What We Can Learn from Dead Philosophers. And so when I'm looking at Montaigne and thinking of a Stoic and Epicurus and that sort of thing, how does that tie into the life and the writings, of course, of Eric Hoffer?
Well, first of all, Montaigne was very much into those guys, Epicurus and Stoic and so forth. But Hoffer basically said, I have to find out what I think by myself. Then maybe I can compare it to what other people think. So, for example, he absolutely refused to read anything by Karl Marx, or for that matter, by Freud. He thought these guys had systems of all their own, and if you listen to them, you wouldn't be listening to yourself.
Did he enjoy popularity among the peers that he worked with? I mean, here he became a well-known author, and yet he was still doing manual labor. How did he bring those two together?
Well, he was very much a loner, even on the job. He took a particular stance, which is, I'll go wherever the union tells me to go today, and I don't want a particular partner, or not want a particular partner. Whoever it is, whatever the station is, that's what I'll do. And that's not the way friendships develop. He had a few friends among the union workers, particularly one who was among the most intellectual of them, a real intellectual socialist. And eventually, he and that man's wife got together and stayed together for the rest of their lives. So he had a very small circle of what one would call friends. He had a larger intellectual circle, and he listened a lot. He listened to what his fellow dock workers said. He said, if you want to know what the ordinary working man thinks about any subject in the world, ask me, because I'm going to reflect what my fellow workers say.
Yeah, and Tom, you mentioned that he believed that these believers, effectively, regardless of where they were coming from, were basically the same. But the premise that he came from in terms of their own, I guess he psychoanalyzed people who would join these movements. What was that premise?
Well, the basic sentiment that he saw was that people were frustrated, that they were not able to get for themselves what they wanted, and therefore they put their trust in an outside institution or movement that somehow was going to deliver it to them. And that this was not just a simple matter of frustration, but it also had to do with sort of a feeling that things were better in the past and that they could be better again in the future, that the present was not really something that you had to pay attention to, but you just had to sort of get beyond it. And you needed a belief to do that. So this is what he felt was the essence of the true believer, something who's trying to get through the present in a particular way.
Two people I want you to briefly comment on. One first. He met a lot of interesting people. One was Saul Lelinski, and many viewers of this program know who Saul Lelinski was in his book, Rules for Radicals. And then, of course, get us to the Eric Sevareid interview in 1967, which sort of changed things in terms of taking him from a personal perspective to a much broader perspective.
Well, Saul Lelinski was somebody that he'd been introduced to by intermediaries, and they hit it off, and they corresponded for years. And this was why I would say one of his most intellectual friendships, because Lelinski was a very committed socialist, but he was also a very committed community organizer. And Hoffer liked the way that he was going about helping people in Chicago, in the Chicago area. And by the way, both of them at a later time were castigated for being racist. And this was another thing that actually drove them together, because neither of them were racist in their own mind and tried not to be, but was definitely a part of them. It didn't matter to Hoffer that Lelinski was a leftist, because many of the intellectuals that he interacted with were quite a bit to his own left. He was, in the beginning, very non-political. The insights that he had were not right-wing insights or left-wing at anything. It was sort of a just, let's look at these people as people and see what are the common things to them. So that's a non-political way of looking at it. Later, it seems that the party sort of caught up to him.
And the Eric Sevareid interview, and Dennis, we might want to remind our audience who Eric Sevareid was.
Eric Sevareid was the leading correspondent at CBS at the time when I was there, which is in the late 60s. Walter Cronkite, whom I worked with, was, of course, the most best known anchor of them all, but Sevareid was the chief correspondent. And after there had been a small public television series with Hoffer and a wonderful article takeout in the New Yorker, Sevareid decided to put him on his bucket list of people that he really wanted to talk to. And Sevareid was the most urbane guy you'd ever seen. I mean, you looked at him and you said, why can't I look that good? Why can't I be that articulate? And why can't I have that sort of access to presidents and prime ministers that he had? He was doing a terrific job of that. And he discovered that he and Hoffer had both ridden the rails in the early 1930s. And they got together on that. They were very, very different in style, but they became close friends. And Sevareid would say, oh, Eric, I've been plagiarizing you to very good effect in my speeches lately. So they did this wonderful interview in 1967. And I remember being at CBS. We had the same executive producer when Sevareid came in with the rough cut of his Eric Hoffer interview. And it was just spectacular. And he said, you know, I'm going to fight for this. Don't cut it down. Don't do anything like that. 1 hour, I guarantee you'll get a great audience. And indeed they did. And it changed Hoffer's life. And Sevareid apologized to him. He said, I'm going to change your life. And Hoffer said, what do you mean change my life? I'm 65 years old. You know, I've got all the money I need. I have a girlfriend and I've got a next publishing contract. How are you going to change my life? Well, in fact, it did change his life.
Well, yeah, he did.
A public intellectual.
Right.
And that's when he became a household name, in a sense.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he did change his life. Television will do that. We're going to change yours too, Tom. So then after a while, he sort of faded from view. But after 9/11, people sort of said, well, who is this Eric Hoffer and what is this true believer? And I'm going to play a short clip for you from a documentary that Nikki and I did in the middle 2000s on terrorism. And we interviewed Fathali Moghadam. And It was the Roots of War documentary that we did. And we asked him then, what were the causes from his perspective behind the actions taken by these people? And here's what he had to say.
Terrorism is fundamentally arising from psychological feelings of deprivation. You can be relatively wealthy, but feel as if you have been deprived of justice. So it's always relative to who you are comparing yourself to. The international media is giving out images of affluence and freedom. So people in the third world are seeing these images, they are receiving the messages, and they are comparing themselves to the ideals being presented in the Western media. If I am sitting in Saudi Arabia seeing images of freedom and affluence, and I'm being told by the American president that I should aspire to be free, what am I going to do? I'm going to look for ways to improve my situation.
Okay, so Tom, you've seen that clip. Do you think Eric Hoffer would basically have agreed, or he would have agreed with Eric Hoffer about why people went into these things?
Yes, I think Hoffer would have agreed. And remember that Hoffer wrote in a period when our mass media were not quite astonishingly all over the place as they are now. I was reminded when I watched the clip of what Gorbachev said, what brought down the Soviet Union was internal pressures, but it was also CNN and all the images of American plushness that proliferated throughout Russian television. So but the notion of the true believer as wanting, as needing, as envious, as unable to complete himself by himself is a very important thing. And you ask about Hoffer after 2001, when his books were rediscovered, and they were rediscovered because people wanted to know, or wanted to try and find out if they could, what kind of person could have flown these planes into the Trade Center? What kind of person? And the phrase that came out was somebody who was a true believer, who believed in what that particular movement was going to do, and was willing not only to commit suicide, but also mass murder in the service of that. And this was an enormously difficult concept for Americans to understand why somebody would do something like this. And so they turned to philosophers in the sense of Hoffer giving a particular philosophy for how this happened, or could have happened. He was, of course, long gone by that time. But that was another resurgence of interest in him.
Tom, you're absolutely right. One of my favorite journalists who has since passed away, and Dennis, I know you know her as well, and that's Georgianne Geyer. And Tom, you mentioned her quite a lot in your book, and she said, Hoffer provided a framework to understand the apparent madhouse of the modern world. We've talked about who makes up these mass movements as true believers, but what about the leadership? What did Hoffer say about the leaders who were able to direct these movements?
He said really very little about the identity of the leaders. What he did talk about was things that they were able to utilize. And he said the basic thing is to paint a picture of the future that's sort of a reimagined, better past. And that this is an absolutely essential thing. You are offering hope. Mass movements offer hope. They offer insight into a future that's going to be better than the present. And if it repeats some of the past, that's fine, but it's going to be better. It's going to be better for you. They're selling hope. They're not selling despair. They're not selling pure anger. There is a hope that is being offered. And this, he said, is a very clear thing that the leaders do. He wasn't talking about any leader in particular, whether it was Hitler or Stalin or for that matter, even FDR, who he thought had marshaled mass movements properly to do things that were possible.
Well, we just have a little bit of time left, but I do want to ask you, where does religion and faith fit into Hoffer's framework?
Faith, he thought, is a kind of believing and belonging. Faith does not exist, in Hoffer's view, independently of belonging to a group. You can have faith in yourself, but that's a little bit different. What he is talking about faith, and I believe that you are too, is in a particular religious notion or things like that. And he said, this is very important to do as part of a group. You gain something personally from being part of the group, having faith along with you.
Well, as Jim said, we just have a minute or so left. Tom, I want that viewer to know that Hoffer's views weren't always negative. Mass movements could be positive. Would you agree with that?
Yes, he didn't know much about positive mass movements because they were a little hard to see. Actually, one was right in front of him that he didn't really want to see because he was so annoyed at his own one, which was the union movement, which had done very positive things, especially in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But he was a little bit at odds with the head of his union, who was an avowed communist named Harry Bridges. And so that he didn't quite see that. He was an individualist, somebody who felt he could come and go as he pleased.
Well, fascinating character. The fact that you read all those notebooks and did that great book, which we recommend to the viewers to watch. And one of the things that I thought was also interesting, and he said that all mass movements may not have some great goal, but they all have a devil in them. So I want everybody to think about that. We appreciate your joining us. We've given you some, I think, interesting perspectives on a very interesting person. Tom, we appreciate your being here. Jim and I always enjoy visiting with people like you. Check McCuistionTV.com for other programs on this and other subjects. Follow us on Twitter, of course, and Facebook. And as always, thank you for joining us as we talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email NikkiN@NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.